Tonight, we're covering the rise and fall of one of history's most brilliant and ambitious leaders, Napoleon Bonaparte. From humble beginnings on the island of Corsica to the imperial throne of France, Napoleon reshaped Europe through military genius, political strategy, and sheer force of will. Loved by some, feared by many, and remembered by all, his story is one of glory, power, and eventual exile. So, before we all get nice and comfortable, take a moment, if you haven't already, to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know the time and location from which you are watching. Now, let's dive into this incredible tale of ambition and downfall, and we hope it helps you learn while you sleep. The story of Napoleon Bonaparte begins not in the heart of France, nor on the blood-soaked fields of Europe, but on a sun-soaked island in the Mediterranean. Corsica, the rocky, pine-covered isle where he was born in 1769, had only just become a part of France a year before. The people there still considered themselves Corsican first, French second, and young Napoleon was no exception. Born to Carlo Bonaparte and Letizia Ramolino in the city of Ajaccio, Napoleon was the second of 13 children, though only 8 would survive into adulthood. His family belonged to the minor nobility, a class that enjoyed certain privileges but often lacked the wealth to sustain them. His father, a lawyer and supporter of Corsican resistance leader Pasquale Paoli, had aligned with the French when resistance efforts faltered. As a result, the Bonaparte family found themselves both resented by their neighbors and reluctantly integrated into French society. Napoleon's early years were marked by a mix of pride and hardship. He was intensely aware of his heritage and of the poverty that clung to his family like a shadow. His mother, stern and devout, instilled in him a sense of discipline and self-reliance that would shape the course of his life. His father's ambitions, on the other hand, sent young Napoleon far from the familiar hills of Corsica to the cold, formal world of mainland France. At the age of 9, he was enrolled in a military academy at Brienne-le-Château. There, Napoleon stood out, and not for reasons he might have liked. His Corsican accent was thick, his French grammar flawed, and his manners considered rough. Other boys mocked him. He, in turn, retreated into himself. He studied obsessively, immersing himself in mathematics, history, and the lives of great leaders from ancient times. His idols were not kings or nobles, but Roman generals, men of action, vision, and iron discipline. During his years at Brienne, and later at the elite École Militaire in Paris, Napoleon developed a remarkable focus. While other cadets pursued leisure or politics, he continued to cultivate his skills and ambition. At just 16 years old, he graduated and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the artillery, a position that suited his love for precision and strategy. Though he had arrived in France as a stranger, Napoleon had now tied his fate to the French military. And he entered it during a time of profound change. The winds of revolution were beginning to stir across the nation. The old order, with its rigid class structure and crumbling monarchy, would soon be swept away in a tidal wave of violence and idealism. For a young officer hungry for recognition and advancement, this upheaval would prove both dangerous and full of opportunity. As the 1780s came to a close and the French Revolution ignited the streets of Paris, Napoleon watched with a calculating eye. He had no loyalty to the crown, nor to the nobility that had so often looked down on him. He believed in merit, in rising by one's talents, not birth. The revolution's promise of equality and advancement by ability struck a chord deep within him. Yet Napoleon was not a man of ideology. He was a man of pragmatism, of results. He saw the revolution not only as a movement, but as a ladder. And he would climb it, no matter who was above him, or what he had to step over to reach the top. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, it set France ablaze with both chaos and possibility. The monarchy crumbled, the aristocracy fled or fell to the guillotine, and society itself was unmade and rebuilt, again and again. For many, it was a time of terror, uncertainty, and bloodshed. But for Napoleon Bonaparte, now a junior officer in a newly volatile army, it was a moment of profound opportunity. The very structures that had once denied men like him a future were collapsing, and in their place stood a promise, advancement based not on title, but on talent and boldness. As the French Republic waged war on external monarchies and fought to defend its revolution, Napoleon's military career accelerated. In 1793, he found himself thrust into action at the Siege of Toulon, a coastal city held by Royalist forces and their British allies. It was there that he first caught the attention of the revolutionary leadership. Though only 24, Napoleon devised an artillery strategy that led directly to the city's recapture. His cool-headed efficiency and aggressive use of cannon fire stunned his superiors, and soon after, he was promoted to brigadier general, a meteoric rise for a man who had just recently been scorned as a Corsican outsider. It was during this period that Napoleon began to craft not only his career, but his image. He understood the power of perception, and while he worked tirelessly behind the scenes, studying maps, calculating ballistics, planning routes, he also made sure his victories were known. Reports of his leadership, courage, and innovation began circulating in revolutionary papers. He wasn't just winning battles, he was becoming a symbol of the Republic's strength. But France's political turmoil continued. Factions rose and fell, the guillotine remained ever busy, and power shifted constantly. In 1795, Paris itself faced insurrection. Royalists and conservatives attempted to overthrow the ruling Directory, and the streets filled with unrest. It was Napoleon, still barely known outside military circles, who was called upon to quell the uprising. With brutal efficiency, he ordered grape shot fired into the mobs, a tactic so devastating and swift that the revolt was crushed in a matter of hours. The event became known as the whiff of grape shot, and it solidified his reputation as the man who saved the revolution. For his loyalty and results, Napoleon was rewarded. At just 26, he was given command of the Army of Italy, a post many viewed as undesirable, given the poor state of its troops and supplies. But Napoleon did not hesitate. He took control of the ragged, underfed army and transformed it. Through relentless drills, impassioned speeches, and personal charisma, he turned despair into energy, and disorder into purpose. Then, in 1796, he led his reformed army into northern Italy against Austrian forces, one of Europe's great powers. What followed was a campaign of stunning brilliance. Napoleon used speed, terrain, and deception to outmaneuver and defeat larger forces again and again. His soldiers began to view him not just as a commander, but as a near-mythic figure. He marched them into victory after victory, and along the way, he reshaped how war was fought, replacing the static, lumbering engagements of the past with mobile, fast, and aggressive tactics that caught enemies off guard. By the time he returned to France in 1797, Napoleon was no longer merely a general. He was a national hero, adored by his troops, feared by his enemies, and watched closely by politicians who recognized that this young man had become dangerously popular. What they did not yet see, or chose to ignore, was that Napoleon Bonaparte was not content to remain a servant of any regime. His victories had shown him his power. And power, once tasted, demands more. By the close of 1797, Napoleon Bonaparte had returned from Italy not as a mere military officer, but as a legend in his own time. Paris welcomed him with parades, adulation, and a hunger for stories of his victories over Austrian forces. The French public, weary of political chaos and endless war, had found in him something rare, a leader who delivered results. He was young, daring, and undeniably brilliant. But beneath the uniform and the carefully managed public image, Napoleon was already imagining something far greater than battlefield glory. His gaze had turned toward empire. France's ruling body, the Directory, viewed him with a mixture of admiration and anxiety. On one hand, he was the Republic's greatest general, its most effective weapon in a Europe that had turned increasingly hostile. On the other hand, his ambition, popularity, and independence made him a potential threat. He had more loyalty from his men than many politicians had from their own citizens. The Directory, eager to keep him both busy and far from the capital, approved his next proposal, a military expedition to Egypt. The Egyptian campaign, conceived partly as a strike against British interests in the East and partly as a way to burnish Napoleon's global prestige, was a bold and complex venture. In May 1798, he set sail with a fleet of warships, thousands of soldiers, engineers, and scientists. His ambition was not merely to conquer but to transform. He envisioned an Eastern Empire modeled on the legacy of Alexander the Great. He also brought with him a team of intellectuals who would document, study, and collect knowledge from the ancient land. Initially, the campaign succeeded. Napoleon defeated the ruling Mamluks at the Battle of the Pyramids with superior strategy and firepower, stunning the local population. He marched triumphantly into Cairo and began establishing a French administration. Yet, even as he plotted expansion into the Middle East, disaster loomed at sea. In August 1798, the British Royal Navy, under Admiral Horatio Nelson, located and destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile. Napoleon and his army were suddenly stranded in hostile territory, cut off from reinforcements and unable to return home. The Egyptian campaign soon turned sour. The French faced resistance from local populations and constant harassment from British-backed forces. The harsh climate, supply shortages, and outbreaks of disease wore down morale. Despite victories such as the Siege of Jaffa and the Battle of Mount Tabor, the campaign lacked strategic success and stretched French resources dangerously thin. Napoleon, ever calculating, recognized that his dream of an Eastern Empire was slipping away. Meanwhile, back in France, the political situation had become even more unstable. The Directory, already unpopular, was facing economic collapse, foreign invasions, and internal revolts. The time, Napoleon judged, was ripe for his return. Without informing his superiors, he slipped away from Egypt in the middle of the night in August 1799, leaving his army behind under the command of General Kleber. He sailed for France, risking capture by the British Navy, but managed to arrive safely in October. What he found upon his return was a country ready for change, perhaps even desperate for it. The people, exhausted by years of war and political corruption, looked once again to Napoleon as a potential savior. He had lost his fleet in Egypt, but not his mystique. In fact, the defeat was largely unknown to the public, buried beneath a haze of propaganda and myth. Napoleon saw his chance clearly. He would no longer serve France. He would lead it. And with careful alliances, a swift plan, and the aura of unstoppable success, he would soon become something no Frenchman had been for years: the absolute master of the Republic. When Napoleon returned to France in October 1799, he stepped into a nation teetering on the edge of political collapse. The Directory, the governing body of the Republic, had become a symbol of weakness and inefficiency. France's economy was unstable, her borders threatened, and her citizens exhausted by the endless cycle of revolutions, purges, and promises that never seemed to hold. Into this chaos walked a man who already had the confidence of the army, the admiration of the public, and the sharp instinct to seize power when the moment demanded it. Napoleon wasted no time. Though he had technically returned as a general, he immediately began working behind the scenes to orchestrate a coup d'état. He allied himself with key political figures, most notably Emmanuel Joseph Size, a respected statesman who had grown disillusioned with the Directory. Together, they planned to rewrite the rules of the French Republic. But Napoleon made sure the script would be one he could control. The coup was swift and nearly bloodless. On November 9, 1799, or 18 Brumaire by the revolutionary calendar, Napoleon used loyal troops to force the resignation of the Directory. When members of the legislature resisted, he stormed into the chamber himself, berating them, appealing to their sense of patriotism, and intimidating them with the quiet threat of force. Though his initial speech was clumsy and even met with boos, the military did the rest. By the end of the day, the Directory was gone. In its place stood the consulate, and at its head, a man with a firm grip on power. Napoleon was named first consul, effectively the ruler of France. The new constitution, quickly drafted and approved in a rigged referendum, gave him sweeping powers under the guise of republican governance. There were still assemblies, still laws and ministers and robes and titles, but the machinery of the Republic now answered to one man. His rise had been packaged as a restoration of order, a return to rational government, but in truth, It marked the beginning of authoritarian rule cloaked in revolutionary ideals. In the months that followed, Napoleon set about reorganizing France with astonishing energy. He restructured the tax system, brought stability to the currency, created the Bank of France, and reformed the chaotic legal system. Roads were repaired, schools reopened, and public order restored. He reached out to former enemies, including exiled aristocrats and the Catholic Church, offering them reintegration in exchange for loyalty. Many accepted. Even the Pope came to terms with Napoleon, signing the Concordat of 1801, a symbolic reconciliation between the French state and the Vatican. But while these reforms earned him genuine praise, they also served a deeper purpose. Every policy, every restoration of order, tightened his grip on power. Napoleon understood that the French people did not crave freedom as much as they craved stability, and he would offer it on his terms. The military, meanwhile, remained his sharpest tool. He reorganized the army and launched new campaigns in Italy and against Austria. Victories came swiftly. At the Battle of Marengo in 1800, he cemented his position not only as a political leader, but still as a brilliant general. His popularity soared. The image of Napoleon as France's savior, a man who could govern with discipline, fight with genius, and bring dignity back to a battered nation, took root in the national imagination. By 1802, he had been declared first consul for life. He had all but replaced the Republic with a one-man regime. The revolution had not died, it had evolved, transformed into a new order bearing one name at the center. Napoleon Bonaparte had seized the Republic not with bloodshed, but with calculation. And he was not finished climbing. By the beginning of 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte had already accumulated more power than any French leader since the days of the monarchy. But titles alone no longer satisfied him. Though he ruled as first consul, with the ability to appoint officials, command the military, and direct foreign policy, he remained technically a servant of the Republic. Yet, in every gesture and every law, Napoleon was already more sovereign than republican. What remained was to give form to what had become reality, to transform power into permanence. Whispers of monarchy began to circulate among the political elite. Some feared it. Others welcomed it. Many believed France needed a strong, hereditary figure to ensure stability. Napoleon, ever aware of appearances, allowed these conversations to grow naturally. He neither confirmed nor denied his ambitions, but at the right moment, he stepped forward to claim what he believed destiny had already placed within his reach. On December 2, 1804, in the Grand Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself Emperor of the French. The ceremony, full of splendor and deliberate symbolism, marked the end of the French Republic in all but name. Pope Pius VII attended, but was given a passive role, a clear signal of where true authority now lay. When the moment came to place the crown upon his head, Napoleon took it from the Pope's hands and placed it upon himself, as if to declare to the world that his legitimacy came not from church or tradition, but from his own will. The coronation was more than theatrical display. It was the declaration of a new era, not a restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, but a reimagining of empire, forged through revolution and guided by merit. Napoleon promised a government of order, logic, and progress. He introduced the Napoleonic Code, a civil legal system that would outlive him and influence nations across the world. He streamlined the bureaucracy, modernized education, and established institutions built to serve the state, not aristocratic privilege. But his empire was not confined to laws and ideas. It was an empire of expansion, of ambition written across maps. Napoleon saw France not only as a nation, but as the heart of a vast European order, shaped by his vision. He returned to war with renewed determination. The fragile peace with Britain, signed only 2 years earlier, had collapsed. Once again, Europe was at war. Coalitions of monarchies formed to check his growing influence, Austria, Russia, and Britain chief among them. But Napoleon, commanding armies with unmatched agility and imagination, responded with overwhelming success. His strategy was not simply to fight, but to move faster, strike harder, and break the enemy's will before they could understand his design. In 1805, he launched one of his most daring campaigns. Marching across Europe, he maneuvered with such speed that Austrian forces found themselves surrounded before they could retreat. On December 2nd, the first anniversary of his coronation, Napoleon faced the combined armies of Austria and Russia at Austerlitz. The terrain, the fog, the timing, all bent to his purpose. The result was a crushing victory. The Battle of Austerlitz became his masterpiece, often called the Battle of the Three Emperors. The map of Europe began to reshape around him. Kingdoms were reorganized. New puppet states were formed. His brothers and allies were placed on foreign thrones. France seemed invincible. Napoleon, once a boy mocked for his Corsican accent and humble birth, now ruled not only France, but a vast empire stretching from the Atlantic to the borders of Russia. But with power came pressure. With conquest came resentment. And beneath the triumphs, fault lines were already forming. For even the most brilliant of emperors cannot command forever without consequence. At the height of his reign, Napoleon Bonaparte stood as master of continental Europe. He had humbled Austria, outmaneuvered Prussia, and pushed back the Russian Empire. His influence extended beyond France's borders. He restructured German states into the Confederation of the Rhine, placed his family on thrones across Europe, and dictated the policies of defeated nations. From Madrid to Warsaw, from Naples to the Netherlands, his empire cast a long and often unyielding shadow. Yet with each victory came new enemies, and with every treaty signed, resentment simmered. No rival hated him more persistently than Great Britain. Isolated on its island, protected by a dominant navy and buoyed by vast trade networks, Britain remained the one power Napoleon could not bend to his will. He understood that defeating Britain militarily would be nearly impossible without control of the seas, something the French navy could not deliver. The catastrophic loss at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 had made that painfully clear. Admiral Nelson's fleet had crushed the Franco-Spanish navy, and the English Channel remained forever out of reach. Unable to invade, Napoleon turned to economic warfare. He launched the Continental System, a sweeping embargo designed to choke British trade by forbidding European ports under French control from doing business with the British. His aim was simple: ruin Britain's economy by isolating it from the vast markets of mainland Europe. But what seemed brilliant in theory proved devastating in practice. The blockade hurt British merchants, but it also punished European economies that relied heavily on overseas goods. Smuggling flourished. Black markets expanded. Merchants and citizens alike chafed under the weight of economic restrictions. Even Napoleon's allies found the system stifling. Over time, the very nations he had liberated began to feel more like colonies of his ambitions rather than partners in a continental order. Meanwhile, in the Iberian Peninsula, a new crisis unfolded. In 1808, Napoleon overthrew the Spanish monarchy and installed his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne. But Spain, deeply Catholic and fiercely independent, did not accept this quiet invasion. A popular uprising exploded across the country. What began as spontaneous revolt turned into a brutal guerrilla war. British forces under Arthur Wellesley, later known as the Duke of Wellington, landed in Portugal and began aiding Spanish resistance. What followed was a drawn-out, savage campaign that drained French resources and morale. Spain became Napoleon's bleeding wound, a theater where his armies, so accustomed to victory in open battle, found themselves harried by irregular fighters, bogged down in unfamiliar terrain, and outmaneuvered by a disciplined British force. The Peninsular War, though far from his grandest campaign, proved one of his most damaging. For every town captured, another rose in rebellion. For every battle won, new enemies emerged from the hills. While Napoleon battled in the west, unrest stirred in the east. Russia, initially a reluctant ally, had grown increasingly dissatisfied with the continental system. The embargo damaged its economy, strained relations, and eroded trust. Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I maintained a fragile alliance, but it was one held together by mutual suspicion. By 1811, it was clear that Russia would no longer comply with the embargo. Faced with defiance, Napoleon prepared for the most ambitious military operation of his career, an invasion of Russia. He assembled the Grande Armée, a massive force drawn from across his empire, over 600,000 strong. It was to be a march of domination, a swift strike to punish disobedience and reinforce his authority. Yet in his quest to command all of Europe, Napoleon overlooked one truth no general could afford to ignore. The continent was vast, its people proud, and winter unforgiving. What awaited him in Russia would not be a campaign of glory, but a march into the abyss. In the summer of 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte began his grandest and most ill-fated military campaign, the invasion of Russia. He believed that overwhelming force would compel Tsar Alexander I to return to the terms of alliance and the continental system. He expected a quick war, perhaps a decisive battle followed by a treaty signed under duress. But Russia, vast and unyielding, had other plans. The Grande Armée, numbering over 600,000 men, was a towering demonstration of Napoleon's military might. It was an army not only of French soldiers, but also of conscripts and allies from across his empire, Poles, Germans, Italians, Dutch, and more, drawn together under a single command. They crossed the Niemen River into Russian territory in June, confident, organized, and equipped for victory. But what awaited them was not glory, it was distance, delay, and despair. The Russian strategy was not to confront Napoleon head-on, but to lure him deeper into their homeland. As the French advanced, the Russians retreated, scorching the earth behind them. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, wells poisoned. The French could not feed themselves from the land, as they often did in other campaigns. Supplies became scarce. Hunger and disease crept through the ranks like invisible saboteurs. Still, Napoleon pressed on. He hoped that Tsar Alexander would not allow the French to reach Moscow without a major engagement. That engagement finally came on September 7th, near the village of Borodino. The battle was one of the bloodiest of the Napoleonic Wars. Over 70,000 men were killed or wounded in a single day. Though the French claimed victory, it was a hollow one. The Russian army was battered, but not broken. It withdrew in good order, and Moscow lay undefended. Napoleon entered the ancient capital with high expectations. He imagined the Tsar would now sue for peace. Instead, he found a city nearly empty and set ablaze. Fires broke out across Moscow, destroying large parts of the city and eliminating any possibility of using it as shelter for the army. The Russian people, and their ruler, refused to surrender. Days turned into weeks. No envoys came. No terms were offered. Winter loomed. Realizing that his army could not survive a Russian winter in a ruined city, Napoleon ordered a retreat. It began in October. What followed was not a withdrawal, but a descent into torment. The retreat from Moscow would become one of the most infamous disasters in military history. The cold struck swiftly and savagely. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. Horses collapsed on icy roads, cannons were abandoned, and soldiers wrapped themselves in rags scavenged from burned villages. Food was almost non-existent. Frostbite and starvation claimed thousands. Russian cavalry and peasant militias attacked the stragglers. The roads were littered with corpses, frozen in place, unburied and uncounted. By the time the remnants of the Grande Armée reached the Berezina River in November, barely 100,000 remained, and many of them were wounded, ill, or starving. The crossing was a nightmare. Under constant Russian fire, the French attempted to build makeshift bridges. Thousands drowned or were cut down trying to escape. Those who survived trudged onward, broken in body and spirit. Napoleon, realizing the magnitude of the disaster, abandoned his army and raced back to Paris, where political threats awaited. He would later describe the Russian campaign as a tragedy caused by the snow, the cold, and treason. But the truth was simpler. He had misjudged the land, the people, and the limits of his own power. Europe, once under his heel, now sensed weakness. The spell had broken. And his enemies, old and new, were preparing to strike. The retreat from Russia had shattered Napoleon's aura of invincibility. Once revered as a master strategist and unmatched general, he now returned to France with the bitter taste of defeat still fresh in his mouth and his Grande Armée decimated. Though he quickly set about raising new forces, conscripting thousands of fresh recruits. Europe had seen what once seemed impossible. Napoleon could be beaten. The nations he had humiliated now rose against him with renewed fury. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia formed the Sixth Coalition, an alliance united by the shared goal of ending Napoleon's dominance. The tide of war began to turn, not just because of the coalition's combined strength, but because even within France and its satellite states, support was beginning to waver. In 1813, Napoleon launched a desperate series of campaigns in Germany, attempting to regain control. He achieved some initial victories, particularly at the Battle of Dresden, but the energy that had once made his army a force of nature was slipping away. His new troops were younger, less trained, and lacked the hardened edge of his earlier soldiers. Supplies were thin, his generals fatigued, and the European resistance was growing more coordinated by the day. In October 1813, at Leipzig, the conflict reached a pivotal moment. Known as the Battle of the Nations, it was the largest battle in European history up to that point. Over 600,000 troops clashed. Napoleon faced a unified army of Russians, Austrians, Prussians, and Swedes. For 3 days, the fighting was brutal and relentless. Though Napoleon's tactical genius allowed him to hold the lines longer than many expected, he was eventually overwhelmed. His army retreated under heavy fire, suffering devastating losses. The defeat marked a definitive shift. The empire was now in retreat. By early 1814, coalition forces crossed into French territory. Town after town fell. Though Napoleon fought valiantly in the 6 Days Campaign, where he delivered several tactical victories against superior numbers, the strategic situation was hopeless. Paris, long shielded from the horrors of war, now stood vulnerable. The coalition approached the capital, and in March, after desperate resistance, Paris surrendered. Napoleon raced to the city, but it was too late. His political support evaporated. Marshals and allies who had once sworn loyalty to him now pressed him to abdicate. The man who had once crowned himself emperor and dictated the borders of Europe was suddenly isolated, surrounded by silence and fear. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon abdicated the throne. The terms were surprisingly lenient. He would retain the title of emperor but be exiled to the tiny Mediterranean island of Elba, where he would rule as a sovereign of a rock barely visible on most maps. He was allowed a small staff, a modest guard, and a pension. The victors believed the threat was over. As he departed, Napoleon bid farewell to the remnants of his imperial guard at the Château de Fontainebleau, embracing each of them in tears. He had risen from nothing, conquered much of Europe, rewritten its laws, and now, in the echoing courtyard of a palace, he was leaving it all behind. For most, exile would have marked the end of the story. But Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had once crossed the Alps, crowned himself under the eyes of a pope, and returned from Egypt against all odds, was not yet ready to disappear. He watched the horizon, and in silence, he began to plan. Napoleon's exile on the island of Elba began quietly. The man who had once commanded the largest empire in Europe now ruled a speck of land with barely 12,000 inhabitants. His palace was modest, his entourage reduced, and his influence seemingly extinguished. Yet even in forced retirement, Napoleon remained Napoleon, endlessly restless, obsessively calculating, and always watching. He attempted to modernize Elba, inspecting its mines, building roads, reorganizing its administration, and overseeing small-scale reforms. But no matter how hard he worked to reshape the island, it could never satisfy his nature. He was not a man built for quiet legacy. From afar he observed the world that had cast him aside, and saw cracks forming in the new order. In France, King Louis XVIII had been restored to the throne by the victorious Allies. But the Bourbon king, seen by many as a relic of the old regime, ruled with caution and stiffness. His efforts to undo revolutionary reforms and restore noble privileges stirred resentment, especially among soldiers and common people who had once served or benefited under Napoleon. The French army, humiliated and disbanded, now sat idle, its loyalty still burning beneath the surface. Napoleon sensed opportunity. The people were disillusioned. The government was weak. The Allies were distracted, And so, in February 1815, after only 10 months in exile, he escaped. With a handful of loyal troops, he sailed across the Mediterranean under cover of night and landed on the southern coast of France near Cannes. From there, he began the boldest gamble of his life, a march not to power, but to Paris. He moved north, not with an army, but with a cause. As he approached each town, soldiers sent to arrest him instead joined him. He spoke directly to them, reminding them of past victories, shared glories, and a France that once stood tall under his command. The further he marched, the larger his following grew. Not a single shot was fired. No civil war erupted. King Louis XVIII, faced with the return of the emperor, fled the capital. On March 20, 1815, Napoleon entered Paris once again, to cheers, to music, to the echo of history repeating itself. Thus began the 100 Days, Napoleon's final attempt to reclaim his empire and reassert his vision of France. He promised peace, reform, and stability. But Europe, stunned by his return, reacted with swift condemnation. The Allies, still assembled at the Congress of Vienna, declared him an outlaw. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia began preparing for war. Napoleon scrambled to rebuild his forces. He had little time and fewer resources, but he rallied veterans, conscripted new troops, and reassembled a formidable army. His plan was to strike fast and divide the Allied forces before they could gather in full strength. He marched into Belgium, where British and Prussian troops under the command of Duke Wellington and Gebhard von Blücher were gathering. What followed was a tense and complex campaign. Napoleon won at Ligny, defeating the Prussians, and pushed toward Wellington, who had taken position near the village of Waterloo. On June 18, 1815, the final chapter of Napoleon's military career would unfold on those muddy fields. He believed he could defeat Wellington before Blücher's forces arrived. The battle began under rain-soaked skies, with fierce artillery barrages and cavalry charges that thundered across the fields. The fighting was brutal, confused, and desperately close. But time betrayed Napoleon. Blücher's Prussian army arrived late in the day, tipping the balance. The French lines, already strained, broke under the combined assault. Napoleon's Imperial Guard, his most elite troops, made a final stand but were overwhelmed. The defeat at Waterloo was not just a military loss. It was the collapse of a dream, the final blow to an empire built on speed, audacity, and brilliance. For Napoleon, there would be no more marches, no more battles, no more returns. The sun that set over the battlefield of Waterloo marked not just the end of a campaign, but the end of an age. Napoleon Bonaparte, once the terror and titan of Europe, fled the field in defeat. His army, once proud and loyal, was shattered. The empire he had resurrected for one last, desperate grasp at power dissolved in a single day of thunder and mud. There would be no escape this time, no quiet retreat to a sympathetic court or friendly coast. The world had seen him rise too high, fall too hard, and return once too often. Napoleon returned to Paris, but it was no longer his. The magic was gone. The same people who had cheered his arrival just months before now greeted him with silence and unease. The political class abandoned him. The Chamber of Deputies turned cold. On June 22, 1815, just days after Waterloo, Napoleon abdicated for the second time. This time, it was final. The Bourbon monarchy would be restored again, and the Allied powers, burned once already, would make no mistake about what must come next. Fleeing the reach of advancing enemy troops, Napoleon surrendered himself to the British, trusting, perhaps naively, that they would offer him asylum or a quiet retirement on neutral soil. But the British had no intention of allowing a second Elba. They had seen what 10 months of exile could lead to. This time, he would be sent far away, to a place from which no return was possible. In October 1815, Napoleon was exiled to St. Helena, a remote volcanic island in the South Atlantic, over 1,000 miles from the nearest continent. There would be no empire to run, no armies to command, no plots to hatch. The man who had once redrawn the map of Europe would live out his days on a barren rock, surrounded by a handful of loyal companions and watched over by suspicious British guards. His residence, Longwood House, was damp, isolated, and ill-suited to a man of his stature. The climate was harsh. The food was poor. The British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, treated him with cold formality, strictly limiting communication and inspecting all correspondence. Napoleon's health declined. The man who once rode across continents and stood unshaken before cannon fire now spent his days dictating memoirs, walking through gardens, and staring at the horizon. Yet even in confinement, Napoleon shaped his legacy. He spoke endlessly of his life, his campaigns, his reforms, and his vision for France. He portrayed himself as a martyr of history, a misunderstood genius who had only ever wanted order, justice, and glory for his people. His companions recorded his every word, and his myth began to grow even as his body wasted away. On May 5, 1821, after 6 years on St. Helena, Napoleon died, likely of stomach cancer, though some would later speculate poison. He was 51 years old. His final words, whispered as his breath faded, were, "France, the army, head of the army. Josephine." They buried him on the island, far from the homeland he had ruled and reshaped. But even in death, his story was not yet done. 2 decades later, in 1840, his remains were returned to Paris and interred at Les Invalides, beneath a grand dome and with military honors. The man who had been an emperor, a prisoner, and an exile was now a national symbol, complex, controversial, but undeniably eternal. Napoleon Bonaparte's life was not merely a sequence of wars and victories. It was a testament to the power of ambition, intellect, and charisma, and to the consequences of overreaching one's limits. He reshaped France, challenged Europe, and redefined leadership in the modern world. His shadow still stretches across battlefields, legal systems, and the very idea of greatness. In the end, he was not simply defeated. He passed into legend,